Hello and welcome back to the Wasteland, everybody. Welcome back to Fallout. We've got ourselves another tier list here, and this is going to be going over all the creatures in Fallout New Vegas. And I'm going to be ranking them in our tier list, which we have a couple different tiers now. So we have the Apex Predators at the top. These are the biggest, scariest things. Fearsome Foes, meaning they can be pretty tough. At Worthy Adversaries, something that's pretty decent, but maybe not always the most challenging, or once you get decent gear, it's not so bad. Mild Menace, meaning not too bad to fight most of the time. Maybe it will be kind of a problem early on. And then the Harmless Critters, where they don't really pose that much of a threat. You might just want to use them as like farming XP, or you might just ignore them altogether when you're playing the game. So we do just have the creatures here. This is not going to be including absolutely everything that is considered an enemy. I didn't include any humanoid enemies, so no mutants, no ghouls, no humans, no ghost people, no trauma packs. Anything that was once human or is kind of human didn't really make it on this list. Sort of, you could argue maybe the Spore Carriers are kind of human in this too, and same with the Tunnelers, because they sort of are, but yeah, maybe. This is going to be kind of a loose list, and we're not going to be going over exactly every single type of enemy here either. So I will be kind of mentioning if they're noteworthy, with the exception of like named enemies or legendary enemies, because I don't really think that that's fair to put on here either. Maybe we'll do an entire other list that's just the named enemies and stuff too. So first up, we've got dogs and coyotes. These ones I'm just kind of grouping together because they're basically the same thing. They're enemies that you can find all over the wasteland. They're fairly common. They're not really that much of a danger. They can be in large amounts and in tight areas. Like I know the Nipton Town Hall can be kind of annoying with all the Legion mongrels in there. But most of the time they're not that bad. Really any type of playstyle works pretty well against them. Melee works incredibly well. Unarmed works incredibly well. Guns work fine, energy weapons work fine. Explosives might be a little bit difficult to hit just because they're faster, but for the most part, the coyotes and the dogs, for that matter, really aren't that scary. And they're both going to go into the harmless critter tier, because outside the early game, you can largely just ignore the dogs and coyotes, and they're not really that much of a threat. If they are biting you, just pull out a melee weapon and smack them or something. Then we've got the Rad Roach, which the Rad Roach is a staple of Fallout, but unfortunately in New Vegas, there's barely any Rad Roaches whatsoever. You see them every once in a while. They can appear in certain vaults, but most of the time they don't really hang around. They don't even have a legendary version of the Rad Roach. Literally any type of weapon works extremely well against Rad Roaches, so they are going to the very bottom of Harmless Critter. If, like, your bare hands, which your bare hands are actually pretty strong, but even if worse weapons than just your bare hands have to be used against these, and they're considered viable weapons, like the BB gun, rolling pin works really well against these. It's just like all the worst weapons actually work pretty well against these, and that kind of means that it's not really all that threatening of a bug. Then we've got the Geckos. Geckos I have split up because they are kind of distinct from one another. The base Geckos just aren't really that scary. You find them around Good Springs, you find them around the Wasteland. They might run up and smack you. They are pretty quick, but they don't do that much damage. They don't really have any scary attacks or anything like that, so they're also going to go into the harmless critter tier. Nothing real scary here. Then we got Bighorners. Bighorners do actually have a decent amount of health, and they can do a decent amount of damage, but they're such a big target and they're such easy farms though that Bighorners usually aren't a threat. They're not going to go out and attack you. You have to go close to them for them to attack you. They can knock you down, which in combination with other enemies might be an issue, but if it's just one Bighorner, you shouldn't have any problem fighting them whatsoever. Mostly they're just kind of XP bags, and I would put them also into the harmless critter tier. They're nothing. And then we've got Bark Scorpions, which Bark Scorpions you do see quite a bit throughout the Wasteland, and they are a little bit unique. They are technically the weakest of the Scorpions, however they have the strongest venom. The venom actually does decent damage and can linger for quite a while, so if you do get stung by these, it can actually hurt you, and in the early game, you shouldn't underestimate these, even if they are relatively slow, and even if a lot of the time they do get stuck in the ground in New Vegas. I would at least put the Bark Scorpions slightly higher than these other ones into the Mild Menace. It's a little bit scarier, although not by very much. Most weapons take care of them, no problem. Really any weapon type works really well against them since they're not super quick. Then we have the Golden Geckos, which these ones are a little bit more rare. There's a couple areas throughout New Vegas where you can find them. They do move just as fast as regular geckos, and whenever they hit you, they actually do a pretty decent amount of damage. Their damage and damage per second can actually be kind of scary, at least in the early and mid game. Even to late game, if you underestimate them, they can do a decent amount. They can also put radiation on you, which is kind of interesting. So it can up your rads, which usually, hopefully, won't kill you. If it is, then I'm assuming you're running like a Rad Child build or something like that, and you're just trying to get the most out of your rads. but that would be about the only case where those rats might actually kill you. In any other case, they probably shouldn't, but they might up your rad level by like 1, and that is negative effects, assuming, again, you don't have something like Rad Child on there. So I'd put the Golden Gecko into the worthy adversaries. I think they're a bit scarier than the rest of the things we've talked about so far. And then we have the Rad Scorpions. This includes regular Rad Scorpions, small Rad Scorpions, and the giant Rad Scorpions. There's also technically the Rad Scorpion Queen, but I feel like that's kind of a one-off thing too. The regular Rad Scorpions aren't too scary. They are fairly tanky though. They have a decent amount of health. They can hit you somewhat hard in the early game, and they do have the venom, which makes it so you take damage over time, which can be really annoying. And for the regular Rad Scorpions, I'd probably put them into the mild menace. Same with the Bark Scorpions. They are a bit scarier than the Bark Scorpions generally. But for the giant scorpions, I would put them up into the worthy adversary because they do actually have a lot of armor. They have 18 damage threshold on them, so armor-piercing rounds actually help a lot against these. Regular rounds and hollow points don't work very well at all against them, which I do like that this enemy does have armor. And they can actually be pretty scary. They do high damage. They do really high damage at the start. They're not super difficult to take out, though. Even in the early game, they're really not, especially if you have some explosives like frag mines, frag grenades, grenade launcher, grenade rifle, whatever you got. You can break these things' legs pretty easily and then just outpace them, and since they're a big target, it's not hard to just keep shooting them. If there's a lot of them, then they can be pretty scary, and there is quite a few places early on where you can actually bump into quite a few of the giant Rad Scorpions, so early on these might actually go up to the fearsome foe, but towards the later game, I wouldn't say that they're that scary, and they would go down to the worthy adversary, so I guess I'll just keep them there. And then we've got Night Stalkers. Night Stalkers are a combination of a rattlesnake and a coyote, and they are much scarier than either of those things in this game. You don't really find rattlesnakes, but these ones move very fast. There's usually a lot of them. They usually hunt in packs. They hit pretty hard, and indoors they are very scary. So the Night Stalkers are basically always something to worry about. They're pretty scary in Old World Blues too, because there can be actually a huge amount of them in there. Explosives do help quite a bit, or just weapons that can cripple them quickly help quite a bit, but they still have a lot of HP. Melee is actually surprisingly strong against these too, because you can actually outpace them just by walking backwards with melee, so long as there's nothing that's actually going to block you from moving back, so as long as you don't bump into anything, and then just keep swinging. You can kill them actually pretty quick then, but even so, they are definitely a fearsome foe. They are probably one of the scariest things. They are one of the abominations too, so if you get the Purifier perk with melee, you can kill them even quicker. That's kind of nice. And then we've got giant ants. Giant ants aren't super common throughout New Vegas, but there are quite a few of them, and there is a couple different variations of this, usually workers and soldiers. Those are going to be the main things that you got to worry about. Soldiers being the bigger and stronger ones, having more HP and being able to hit harder. There is also the smaller ones, and there is the queen, but the smaller ones you don't have to worry about. The queen, there's only a handful of queens throughout the game. Workers, I would probably put into like the harmless critter one, but the soldiers, I would probably put into the mild menace, because they at least can tank through quite a few shots early on in the game where you might find these, and they can still deal decent damage if you allow them to get up close to you. They're still not like one of the scariest enemies though, even at the start of the game. They're okay though. They're not as scary as like the Rad Scorpions, I would say. Then we have one of the big boys here, which is the Deathclaw. And the Deathclaws in New Vegas are no joke. The Deathclaws in New Vegas are probably the scariest version of Deathclaws in any of the games. I still like the Fallout 4 Deathclaw design the most, but New Vegas definitely instilled the fear of Deathclaws in them. They do really high damage, they move very fast, they can tank through a lot of damage as well. They completely ignore armor too with their claws, so it doesn't matter how much armor you stack on there, they're still just going to smack you all the same. And if you're playing on like the very hard difficulty, they can 1 or 2 shot you a lot of the time, especially in Lonesome Road where they're even stronger, where it's not uncommon at all for a maxed out character to get 1 or 2 hits. So yeah, these things are absolutely going up to Apex Predator like they deserve. They are very scary. There's not a whole lot of them though. They're just in a couple areas. Basically any build can fight them, but you do need decent gear for this. Explosives can work fairly well, since if you break their legs then they don't move as fast. That can help. You can actually outrun them then. If they don't have broken legs, then they will still be able to outrun you. Melee can actually be surprisingly good against them, melee and unarmed, because if you do manage to knock them down with like Super Slam or Paralyzing Palm or something, then you can just completely wail on them, and a one-on-one isn't so bad. It's just when there's more than one is when it becomes really bad just in general. And these are just the standard Deathclaws. These aren't even all of the unique Deathclaws that are in the game too. Then we have the Fire Ant. And the Fire Ant, you're probably going to find a couple of these. They're not super common. You do find them out in like the dry lake. That's probably like the main place where you're going to see them. They can blow fire on you. They're basically the same as regular ants, just they have a flamethrower attached to them, which makes it so damage and damage per second can be kind of scary with this, and damage over time. If you can't kill them quickly and you're doing like a melee or an unarmed build, they're going to eat through your medical supplies, but they're not super scary. They are scarier than these other bugs here, so I'm going to put them up into the worthy adversary. Then we've got lake larks, which are also not a super common enemy. You can find quite a few places where there is a lot of them, but you don't usually have to go there. And these ones are the only like lurk enemies in the game. They can hit you with melee, and their melee does hurt pretty bad, but they're not usually going to do that. They're usually going to do their sonic ranged attack, which has a very high amount of damage that it deals and a very high chance of actually crippling limbs. It's not uncommon whatsoever to have like broken limbs, or for these things to stack attacks if there's multiple of them and just kill you outright. That's happened to me quite a few times when playing on very hard. And they are pretty scary. They're not one of the scariest things, though. They're not as scary as, like, the Deathclaw. They're probably not even as scary as the Night Stalker a lot of the time, just because these can get on top of you so quick. So I would put them up into the fearsome foe. You definitely should take caution when seeing them, but you can pick them off fairly quick with most builds. Cazadors are probably the most annoying enemy in the entire game, and one of the scariest enemies in the game, because you can find these right at the very start of the game. These things move very fast, they do really high damage, they can attack quickly, they will definitely outpace you if their wings aren't broken, and they also have venom on them, so they deal damage over time, so even if you kill them, you might die afterwards. These things are very scary, and I would actually put them up into the Apex Predator. You can take care of them in quite a few different ways, though. They're not unbeatable or anything like that. With explosives, you can beat them pretty easily, because explosives just have a high chance of breaking limbs, and if you break their wings, then they move substantially slower and you can actually outrun them. If they have their wings, then there's no chance that you can outrun them. Fast-firing weapons also help really well, like submachine guns and assault rifles are very good against these. Just spray at their wings. There is one strategy you could do at the very start of the game, like go and grab the 9mm submachine gun from Doc's house, repair that up, and then you can potentially go and kill the Cazadors up near Chance's knife and where the Great Khan area is. You might run through bullets there, so you might have to wait a couple days in Good Springs just to keep Chet's store and buy more and more 9mm rounds. But that is a strategy that you could use if you want to go through there quickly. It does work fairly well, and this is probably like the biggest selling point for getting the Entomologist perk in the game, since Cazadors are definitely the scariest bug in the game. Then we've got Brahman, which Brahman are basically the same as Bighorners. You don't see them all that often in New Vegas, at least compared to the Bighorners. They don't pose any threat to you. You can beat them with any weapon. They're going into the harmless critter. You don't have to worry about them. And then we've got the giant rats, which are kind of rare in New Vegas. There's only a couple spots for them, and there's the really big rats, which can be the rodents of unusual size, and those ones are substantially scarier than the normal rats. Normal rats really don't pose that much of a threat to you. They're usually small, they usually do low damage, they don't attack super quick, so they can be kind of hard to hit though. That can be a little bit annoying. And the regular rats I'd probably put into like the harmless critter tier. You can find them in like the sewers and stuff. But the other bigger rats, they would actually probably go up into like B tier. They are really scary at the start because you might want to go and get the Rat Slayer right away. Since it's such a good sniper rifle, you will want to either deal with those quickly or just avoid them altogether by running past them. Either way works, but yeah, the giant rats are actually kind of scary in that area. Then we've got the giant mantis. Giant mantis you can find throughout various parts of the game. They're not super common. You do see a couple of them in Good Springs, but they're the nymphs that you can actually just walk over and kill. The bigger ones are a little bit scarier, and the ones in Zion are actually quite a bit scarier, the giant ones, since they do high damage. I think the mantises also ignore armor. I could be wrong about that. They might just have really high damage by default. And if there is quite a few of them, then they can overwhelm you. In tight areas, they can also be particularly scary. So I'd put them up into the worthy adversary. And then we've got the Spore Carriers, which the Spore Carriers are the Trogs from Fallout 3, basically. These ones you're only going to find in a couple of areas. You can find them in Zion, and they're a bit stronger there, and you can also find them in the vault. They don't do that much damage. There is multiple variations of them, where there's the standard Spore Carrier, the Brute, and the Savage. Savage has the most amount of health, the most amount of damage, so those ones can actually be kind of scary, but for the most part, these aren't that scary of a thing. I'd put them into the worthy adversary, depending on when you do these quests. Then we've got the Spore Plants, which I think are not as scary as these. They just sit still, they spit acid at you or spit poison at you, which can deal damage. It can be a little bit annoying, but there's only like 2 areas in the game where these things actually are. One is in the vault and one is in Zion, so this one's going to go into the mild menace just because there's not very many of them. Then we have the green geckos. These geckos you find in Zion, and they are by far the strongest of the geckos. They have a spit attack that deals pretty high damage to you. It can actually do quite a bit. They move very fast, they hit pretty hard, they can be pretty tanky too. They're not one of the most tanky things, but they are actually pretty scary. I'd put these ones up into the fearsome foe. You could argue them into the apex predator though, because they are actually quite strong, and there's usually more than one of them. Usually there's like 3 or 4 of them, and if they all rush you down, they can kill you really quick. And then we've got the Yaoguais, also in Zion. These ones, I actually couldn't really find footage for. I just didn't find the Yaoguais. They are fairly rare, especially outside of like the main quest in Zion or outside of some of the side quests. These are the gigantic bears, and these ones can be pretty strong. They can tank through a lot of damage, they can move really fast, and they can do a lot of damage. They're all around just a very solid, strong apex predator, and I would put them up there. They don't have anything as crazy as like these two, I would say, even though I'd rather fight Yaoguais than... Yeah, I'd probably rather fight Yaoguais than either of these. The Cazadors just move faster and are sometimes difficult to hit, and the Deathclaws are just straight up the scariest thing in the game. So I would put them a little bit lower than that, but they still belong in the apex predator because sometimes they can just tank through everything and then still beat you to death in just a couple hits. Then we've got the Tunnelers, which is another like apex predator. These things are in the Lonesome Road. There's not a whole lot of them, but there is a couple areas where there is quite a few of them. I should say that they're not widely spread out throughout the Lonesome Road. They are prevalent in a couple areas though, particularly underground and in some of the side areas you can go to, and they are very scary. They can 1 or 2 shot you. They can also be standard tunnelers, which are already really strong, but then there can be the venomous ones that deal damage over time too, which doesn't really seem to be necessary when they can just smack you 2 or 3 times and kill you. These things kind of suck to fight with like melee or unarmed unless you're using a heavy VATS build. Outside of that, they do just kind of suck to fight though, and explosives don't work incredibly well on them either. Not necessarily because they don't take that much damage from it, but because you're almost always fighting indoors with these, and explosives become kind of a hindrance then. Then we've got Bloat Flies, which are not very common in New Vegas either. I'm not sure why these and the Rad Roaches just aren't all that common. They are one of the more difficult to hit enemies, but that's about it. That's their like claim to fame, is that it's hard to hit them. Once you do hit them, they almost always die. Melee and unarmed kills them actually really fast. There is the legendary version of this, which is absolutely S tier and absolutely an apex predator, but those standard Bloat Flies are just harmless creatures, so they're going to go right into there. And then we've got the Cyber Dogs, which I also couldn't find any of them wandering around after Old World Blues. There's only a couple places where these do show up. These are dogs, but then they also have the sonic wave attack similar to the Lake Larks. Usually there's quite a few of them when you do find them, and they can do decent damage and damage per second. They also move fairly fast, so it can be kind of hard to hit them. And these ones I'd actually put up into the fearsome foes. Whenever I go through Old World Blues, I'm always surprised at how much damage these things can actually do to me, especially the military versions, since there's the Cyber Dogs, and then there's the, or maybe it's Cyber Police Dogs, and then there's the Cyber Military Dogs, and the Military Dogs are actually pretty strong. And then we've got Centaurs, which even the strongest version of Centaurs are not very strong. They move really slow. They do technically have like a tentacle whip attack with their tongues. They're pretty gross looking. They can spit at you, which can do some damage, but basically everything beats these guys, and they're more or less just XP bags as well, similar to like Bighorners. Whenever you see them, don't feel bad about killing them whatsoever. They're going into the harmless critter tier. And then we have the Mole Rats, another pretty harmless critter. Mole Rats don't really pose much of a threat. There's not any unique versions of them. There's just the standard ones and the little pups. The pups are actually pretty cute, and it kind of sucks when they keep attacking you, because usually I'll just shoot them then. But the big ones, even the big ones don't pose really any threat, so they'd also go into harmless critter. They're similar to like the Geckos. You might find them all throughout the Wasteland, but they're never scary. Then we have our last one, which is the Fire Geckos. Fire Geckos are one of the more rare geckos to see. They're basically the gecko mixed with the fire ant though, where they can breathe fire, they can attack pretty quick, they can do pretty high damage. They would probably go somewhere into the fearsome foe, in between the golden geckos and the green geckos. Green geckos can tank through more and can do more damage, and their spit is pretty scary. Golden geckos are just less than these ones. You also just don't find them as much, so I think that would be a fair place to put them, although they would probably be higher than some of these other ones. These aren't in any real specific order. But yeah, this would be where I'd put all the creatures in Fallout New Vegas. Again, this is not going over all the legendary versions or all of the variations of these, because there's like 10 different variations of Brahman or something like that, or Bighorners and Brahman. And I don't really think that's necessary to talk about each one of them. None of them are all that scary, but we will be talking about all the legendary enemies at some point, as well as all the named enemies, and we're going to save the robots and the humans for their own list. Thanks for watching this. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Tell me your thoughts on all the creatures in New Vegas. Where would you put them in the tier list? I hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye, everyone!